Professor Smith, will you start this discussion by giving us a brief synopsis of the concept of Black English and a statement on the origin of this linguistic pattern among many Black Americans?
To risk of creating even more confusion, let me first begin by introducing another term, and that term is the word Ebonics. The word Ebonics is a compound of two words, ebony, which means black, and phonics, which means sounds. Now, in 1973, at a psycholinguistics conference convened under a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, a professor by the name of Robert Williams, a psychologist at Washington University, invited a number of scholars in the fields of linguistics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, speech pathology, and audiology to discuss some controversy that was emerging in the literature over the use of that term, Black English, because it became quite apparent to a lot of the African American scholars who were doing research in that area that the term Black English was being used with totally different meanings. And let me explain what the argument was. The term Black English was viewed by the African American linguists as an anomalous statement. An anomalous statement is a statement that contradicts itself. If you say, my sister's an only child, how can she be my sister if she's an only child? Or that bachelor is married. He can't be a bachelor if he's in fact married. When you look at the term Black English, this is what you find. You find people calling the language of slave descendants of African origin Black English. But when you look at the literature that they disseminate about this language, it does not in any way correspond, except in lexical items, to the structure that I know to be the English language. So we question the legitimacy of the use of the term Black English, and instead we pose the term Ebonics, black sounds. We can argue whether or not the patterning of these sounds corresponds more to the English language, or we can debate whether or not they correspond more to the African, Niger-Congo, or Hamitu-Bantu languages. But no one can question that most human languages are spoken by the use of pulmonic egressive airstreams. This is lung air that is egressing. Now, when a linguist goes into a speech community, he does not prescribe how a language ought to be spoken or written. He is merely there to make observations and attempt to make a scientific statement. He is attempting to describe how the language is spoken or written. When the African American scholars began to look at the language of slave descendants of African origin, we began to find patterns that do not correspond to what is known to be the English language. We find patterns that at the base of the historical process can be traced to the African, Niger-Congo, or Hamitu-Bantu languages from which they originated. Now, so we look at the term Black English and we question that term first as an anomalous statement. It contradicts what they are actually disseminating to be English. The other argument had to do with the term Black English in terms of it being a contradiction that no other limited English-speaking population has an adjective of color before their variety of English. I mean, there are limited English Asians, and you don't find the label yellow English before their variety of English. You notice Hispanic Americans who are limited English speaking, who take the same instruments and come up limited or non-English speaking. You don't find the label brown English before these limited English speakers. Native Americans who are limited English speakers are not called, don't have their limited English proficiency label red English, and even the non-standard speaking Anglos, the white trash. I never find any literature discussing the deviant variety of English spoken by the poor Appalachian or Southern whites as white trash English. So we look at the term Black English in that respect. The word black is always represented to the European, something evil, base, licentious, wanton, depraved, corrupt. And when the Europeans who refer to black language as a Black English, they're not talking about the language of Bryant Gumbel or Max Robinson or Ed Bradley or Jane Kennedy. They're not talking about the English of these blacks who happen to be professional speakers of English. They're talking about the non-standard, deviant speech, that corrupt, licentious, wanton, depraved, crooked, all the negative attributes that you can give something is given the word black. And when you look at the literature put out by the agents of U.S. imperialism, the Zionists like Walt Wolfram, William LaBarbe, Joan Barat, all of these Europeans who've been writing about black language, Joe Dillard, Stewart, when you look at their literature, they're not talking about the language of the black educator. They're talking about the non-standard black sounds of black children that do not correspond to English. That's number one.
I wonder, do we have any response to Professor Smith's discussion this far?
Well, let me go a little further.
Very well.
In traditional and in modern linguistics, the relevant criteria for positing a genetic kinship in the language of a speech community is that you can show evidence of a morphological continuity, or the verb system. In other words, knowing the sounds of a language will not make you a speaker of that language, and knowing the words of that language will not make you a speaker of that language. What you must master in order to speak a language is the morphology, or the grammar. Okay? You must know how to inflect for plural and possessive. You must know how to modify nouns. Do you place adjectives in front or after the noun? How do you make past tense, present tense, progressive, or future tense with verbs? If you don't know how to use the morphology of the language, then you're not going to be proficient or not even understood by a speaker of that language. Now, let's look at the English language. The English language is a language that has a grammar that is different from the African languages from which the slave descendants of African origin came. In other words, the African languages from which black people came are labeled Hamitic or Bantu languages. These West African languages had sounds in them that did not exist in the Indo-European languages, and vice versa. There were sounds in the Indo-European languages that didn't exist in the African languages. Whenever the speaker of one language attempts to speak a language that is structurally different from his own, the speaker will exhibit linguistic retentions. These linguistic retentions often occur as interference modifications or transfer phenomena. If you are a native speaker of a language and you are trying to speak a language that's different, if it's phonetically different, you will find differences in the phonology. If it's grammatically different, then there will be grammatical interference. If it's a lexical difference, then you will find lexical retentions or interference. This is what has happened for the slave descendants of African origin. To the extent that a slave descendant of African origin, even though they're living here in the United States, to the extent that they have been living in social isolation, is the exact extent to which you will find the African substratum in their speech. I call your attention first to a work by the fellow Peter Ladefoged. In a work called A Phonetic Study of West African Languages, Peter Ladefoged discovered that West African languages, and he states in particular the Kwa group, do not have consonant cluster configurations. Now, these consonant cluster configurations that don't exist perhaps never existed in the first place. The black people in the United States who are descendants of these people then will have difficulty when they are confronted with languages where consonant clusters exist, articulating consonant cluster configurations. So if you give them a word like west, best, test, last, and fast, you will not find that voiceless apical-alveolar stop preceded by a voiceless dental sibilant, that ST configuration. So west, best, test, last, and fast will be west, best, test, last, and fast. Build, bold, cold, hold, this voiced apical-alveolar stop following a voiced alveolar lateral will not come in a configuration. So build, bold, cold, and hold will be build, bold, cold, and hold. Right on down the line, where these consonant cluster configurations occur in black speech, the final phoneme isn't distributed. It is erroneous to say that the black man then is deleting a final phoneme. The European Zionists who write about black language talk about this deleted final phoneme, or they talk about deletions, omissions, and weakenings and reductions, meaning then that this is something that was supposed to have been there that's not there. You cannot delete, omit, or drop what never existed in the first place.
Well, on that same point, many white scholars have argued that black English, the term you introduced, Ebonics, is an archaic form of a European dialect, and some have even stated that black English is an evidence of genetic and of physical inferiority. What credence do you place on these claims?
Most human beings, at least as far as scientific experiments and evidence shows, all human beings learn the language they speak in the environment in which it's spoken and heard. Arabians speak Arabic because that's what's spoken and heard. Chinese speak Chinese because that's what's spoken and heard. Japanese speak Japanese. Eskimos speak Eskimo. Bantu speak Bantu. Human beings all over the world learn the language they speak in the environment in which it is spoken and heard. If an infant comes into the world and no sound goes through the auricle or pinna into